So we're now on air. So I will start talking anyway. So this is actually a talk which I originally gave to my own department. So it's originally aimed for biologists. So last night I was going through frantically adding some equations. So the way that I angled this talk was really to explain to biologists why it's helpful to do mathematics as opposed to doing simulations. So that's the reason really for having this particular title. But what I'm going to be talking about is the work that I've been doing, I and others, and in particular this chap here, Yevgeny Supernenko, on developing mathematical approximations for individual-based models. So I'll explain why we, in particular, why we are interested in doing that. But the part of this, some of the slides are really just explaining why it's useful to have analytical results rather than having numerical results aimed at a biologist. So please bear with me for those. I imagine that for this audience, I don't really have to persuade you of the importance of that. Again, this was aimed at that particular audience. So I just wanted to make the point that we often use two different paradigms for modelling in science in general, and in particular in biology. And we talk about tactical models, which are the kinds of models which we use for making predictions in very specific kinds of situations. In biology, often they're built directly from data, so they can be just statistical models. You don't necessarily build them out of components which are mechanistic. But that doesn't necessarily matter, provided you have enough data to be able to parameterize them. And we often contrast this to strategic models, the aim of which is not so much to make predictions in very specific situations, but rather to get a general understanding of your system and explore many, many different what-if situations, and just to explore a wide range of parameter values in order to see what kinds of things might be possible with certain components. And these intrinsically have to be more process-based. And typically when we're doing theory, we make use of strategic models, whereas often in the case when we're doing some kind of applied science, we tend to use more tactical models. So lots of classical ecology is based on these very simple models I'm sure you've come across as graduates. Differential equation models which are very transparent. It's easy to see how they're related to mechanisms. They're very easy to analyze. We can make quite general statements about them. And we have lots of machinery for saying what the behavior of these kinds of models are. And lots of ecology is actually based on these kinds of models because of their transparency, and starting from the 1930s, they were the foundation of many of the important ideas in ecology. Unfortunately, many of these theories turn out to be completely wrong. So one great example is the idea, which was put forward in the 1960s, that in order for n species to coexist, there have to be at least n resources. So this kind of niche-based theory was very popular, and some people still believe this to be true. But actually, it's been shown in many different scenarios, and this is one of my favourites, that in fact you can get as many species as you like coexisting on a small number of resources by changing the assumptions of your model. So the simple models which we like to use don't necessarily contain enough biology to understand what the phenomena that we're interested in. But on the other hand, to make a model complicated enough to be realistic, typically we can't do mathematical analysis. And so what this means is that within the past couple of decades, and the rise of powerful computers, much ecological modelling tends to be computer-based rather than based on equations and mathematics. So this talk, and I'll just explain to those who write, so this was actually a talk given to biologists, so please forgive me if some of it comes across as being rather patronising. So it's really just to reinforce that there's still a role for strategic mathematical modelling in ecology and evolution. By using mathematical advances, we can expand the range of models which can be considered tractable beyond the kinds of very simple differential equation models which I showed a couple of slides back. And in fact, there are situations when you can do analysis of more complex models, which usually are simulation-based. And these kinds of analyses, if you use analytical methods rather than simulation-based methods, then you can get some quite different insights and more general insights. And so I'll be giving some examples in this talk. And in order to do this, what we've done is developed the rather grandiose title of a unified framework. Apologies for that kind of terminology. But it is a quite general framework for the kinds of individual-based models which are used in ecology and evolution, combined with a robust approximation. just to illustrate the sorts of the reasons why we need complex individual-based models in ecology, this is just a rather high-profile example from almost 20 years ago, when which was one of the most high-profile examples where simulation-based models, individual-based models, were used to inform government policy. So the foot-and-mouth epidemic, as many of you, I'm sure, remember, started in early 2001. And this is a paper which was published somewhat after the fact. But the point at which the epidemic turnover started to decline, this is the number of cases per, I think, 2 weeks, was the point at which the government instigated this ring-culling policy. The idea being that if there's a farm which is infected, you cull a certain range of farms in the vicinity. And the radius which was decided and the policy itself was informed by simulation models which said, provided you cull for, I think it was 3 kilometres, that would be enough to stop the epidemic. In fact, it turns out that the reduction in the epidemic was actually sharper than was predicted by the models. And there's also a very interesting comment by Roy Anderson, who said, who advised Tony Blair around about this period here. He says, oh, this epidemic is going to go extinct by midsummer, and Tony Blair called an election roughly around about here on the basis that he thought that the epidemic would have finished. And Roy Anderson had to backtrack later on to say that in fact, yes, of course, there's always some sporadic noise, these kinds of epidemics. But anyway, the key thing is that this is a very noisy process, and it's also very spatially heterogeneous. So some of the important complications in ecological models that we have to incorporate are space and stochasticity. So we need to take account of the fact that space is heterogeneous. There are different environments in different places. And also individuals tend to interact only with other individuals that are nearby in some sense. That nearby can be a matter of millimeters or a matter of kilometers. But anyway, it's the interaction between individuals and dispersal is a local process. And also, biology is made up of individuals, and that means that a smooth, deterministic, differential equation-based approach doesn't always capture the granularity of individuals and the fact that many processes are unpredictable and stochastic. So the class of models which we use to take account of this are called in ecology individual-based models, as opposed to agent-based models, which are essentially the same thing. And an individual-based model is one where you model what individuals do rather than just what populations as a whole do. And the properties of these individuals is that they're discrete, they exist somewhere within space, and they have some kind of interactions with others that are nearby. Events happen that can be within the model stochastic, whether they're actually determined by some deterministic process in realities isn't important from the perspective of the model. They can change their state during their lifetime. They know about what's going on in their vicinity, but not necessarily about everything that's happening globally. And their behaviour is affected by their current state and also their local environment, these interactions. So they interact with other individuals, other biological individuals, and also their environment, their abiotic environment. And so they've been used in biology and also in many other scientific areas too. So IBMs tend to be simulated on computers because if you want to describe them mathematically, then the derivation of the equations which they satisfy, moment equations, is typically very laborious, and it's quite difficult to spend the weeks or so that you have to be deriving these equations. And even if you get these equations, what you end up with is an infinite hierarchy of moment equations. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And whilst there are approximation schemes, implementing these is quite difficult, and they're not necessarily very reliable. So what we've done is to address both of these weaknesses. First of all, by having a framework within which we can derive equations describing a quite general class of models. So there's a single derivation of a kind of a meta model from which we can then account the equations for a very specific model. And then also to develop a well-controlled approximation, which again we can apply to this general model, so that any specific model can then be extracted from that. So that the framework which we use to describe these systems is a space of general point process. So we think of individuals as being point-like and living in continuous space. And there can be many, many different types of individuals. So there are different species, different genotypes of individual species. Within a species, they can have several different life history stages. They can be infected, not infected. They can be male and female, and so on. And they interact with their environment within our framework by having some further agents which are non-biotic, so other kinds of individuals which can be plants, they can be ponds, there can be other kinds of geographical features. This is really, it's possible to extend this framework to the case where there is an explicit environment which is not described by agents, but the analysis that I'll describe assumes that all the agents which are there are themselves determined by the same kinds of processes as the biotic individuals. And then on top of this, we have a stochastic dynamics. So individuals can be created, destroyed, or change their states due to interactions with other individuals. So this basic idea has been around for quite a long time. But a few years ago, we together with some mathematicians who are interested in these kinds of problems from a rather different perspective, we put together a framework for describing these kinds of spatio-temporal point processes. So we had a common language between the theoretical ecologists, such as myself, and the mathematicians who are clever and can do the analysis. And then what we've done more recently is to say, okay, well, based on this spatio-temporal point process framework, we can then find a quite general way to describe a large class of processes by saying that any process which takes place is the result of the interactions of reactants, catalysts, and products. So the idea is that a process which involves individuals changing their states is influenced by the presence of other individuals. And so individuals are either reactants, which are present before the event, but then are consumed by it. They're catalysts, which are present before or after the event, or they are products. And so by taking this rather general way of describing these processes, we're then able to do a quite general analysis. And the key thing is that these processes take place at a rate which itself depends upon the relative positions of all these different participants. So just to illustrate some of these reactant catalyst products processes, or how we describe some simple biological processes in this framework, I've used a square to mean a reactant, a circle to be a product, and a triangle to be a catalyst. So mortality is where an individual which dies at a rate mu. This is density-independent mortality. And so what that happens is there's one reactant, there are no catalysts because the death rate doesn't depend upon other individuals, and there's no products. On the other hand, birth, and this is birth where your offspring happens at some distance from yourself. So there's like a seed of a tree forming a new tree. There's a catalyst because the parent is present before and after, and there's a product at some distance x. And the probability that the birth is at a certain distance x is then determined by some kind of spatial kernel. Movements within our framework, we think about as having a reactant, which is the individual at the original position, and a product, which is the individual at the new position. Again, there's some kind of kernel which determines where they are. An infection is where there is a catalyst, which is the infectious individual, a reactant, which is the susceptible individual initially, and a product, which is the newly infected individual. And again, we have an interaction kernel here. So these are the fairly simple propagation processes, but we can build much more complex processes. For example, if we think of amphibian reproduction, where we have to have a male and a female newt mating in a pond and then producing some spawn, then we can have the pond being some kind of agent which says that you can only let the reproduction can only take place if the female's inside of the pond. So we have this kernel H which describes the pond. The pond is a catalyst. The female is actually here a reactant because after the female has produced the spawn, she's then refractory and has to wait some time before producing more offspring. The male is also a catalyst and the spawn are a product. So here, as you can see, there's quite a few individuals taking part in this process. But this can be described in the same framework as the other processes that I described beforehand. So from this reagent catalyst products model, it's important to say that we can write it down for any number of agent types. So it might be that you are concerned about the fact that the way that individuals behave depends on how old they are. So we can represent that by having many, many different ages and just having a process of aging where we switch between different types. And also any combination of these reactant catalyst products processes can be added into our model and analysed in the same way. And so after a little bit of analysis, just to illustrate the kind of results which we have, we describe here, this is a vector of the U is a vector of cubilants, certain kinds of correlation functions. It's a non-linear operator, so the rate at which this changes is a non-linear operator Q on the cubilants. Eta is just some kind of state, some kind of set of coordinates. And this looks like, so this is just an equation which describes how you would write down for a particular process described by product reactions and catalysts. This is a set of individuals at various different points. So these are the positions of the different products, positions of the different reactants, positions of the different catalysts. And this V here is a kind of a generating function. And these here are then operators which create or destroy in individuals. So this is formally how you would write this sort of thing down. So it looks very much like the kind of thing you would get from quantum field theory, but this was derived by mathematicians without all those embarrassing infinities. A laugh there. There's no rest here. Anyway, okay. So that's the basic formalism. Now to develop our approximation. So many of you may have come across moment closure. So the idea behind moment closure is that for a stochastic process, if you use these angular brackets to mean some kind of average, then the rate of change of the average of this process, so that's some kind of density, typically depends upon the density and then higher moments of this density. So let's say a second moment. And the equation for the second moment depends upon third moments and such like, or indeed it can be coupled to still higher moments. This is typically what you find for non-linear stochastic processes. And the problem with this is that even if you can derive these equations, which are feasible, but sort of laborious in general, this forms an unclosed hierarchy because each moment, the equation for each moment depends upon higher moments ad infinitum. So whilst the equations themselves are actually an exact description of a stochastic process, finding a way to evaluate these, even numerically, is very, very difficult. Well, in principle, it's not possible because of the fact that you'd have to calculate the equations for, you have to integrate equations for all of your moments. So there's an approximation scheme called moment closure. I'm guessing many people know about moment closure here. Where you assume that a higher order moment can be written down approximately in terms of lower order moments. So say that the third moment depends upon the product of second moments divided by first moment or something. And these are typically derived in a kind of ad hoc way. You sort of say, well, a 3-point correlation function is a bit like a combination of 2-point correlation functions. These are sometimes true for certain kinds of processes. But broadly speaking, these are basically based on heuristic arguments. And then once you've made this assumption, you can then close your hierarchy, because then if the third moment depends upon second moments, and we can use that expression here within this equation here, we now have the equation just for the first and second moments. At least now we have a closed hierarchy. So just to kind of illustrate how this looks, if we imagine that for our model, there's some kind of solvable limit. Let's just write this here. So in some limit, it looks like ODEs or some other kind of solvable model. And there's something which tunes how strong is the importance of these difficult things, the space and noise. And let's imagine that if we were God and we knew everything about the model, then we know that this is actually how this population density, say, depends upon these parameters here. So this example goes extinct for this range of parameters, and then is no longer extinct over here, for example. Then, as I say, this is the exactly solvable limit, so we know what this is. This is some kind of field, say. We can do some simulations with some error bars, so they tell us something about what's going on for these particular individual values. They don't tell us because we just happen to be unlucky that it actually goes extinct for this range here. And then we do our moment closure. This is kind of what moment closure looks like. It's something which kind of qualitatively describes what's going on around about here, but it can be completely wrong. It's basically an uncontrollable approximation. There's no guarantee that it gives a good approximation anywhere. In fact, it doesn't always necessarily get the exactly solvable limit right. Usually they do, but they don't necessarily. Okay, so moment closure, as I say, it's uncontrolled, and the problem is with it is not just that it's it's not necessarily reliable, but rather that there's no intrinsic way of knowing when it's going to be reliable and when it will be a good approximation. So what we did there instead is we turned to a perturbation approach, where we have a parameter which describes how close we are to this solvable limit, and then we develop an expansion in the small parameter such that we can calculate the coefficients of that expansion exactly. And then, as with the most serious expansions, we can tell how close we are to the exactly solvable limit by how big these various terms are. That's kind of some diagnostic which gives an indication of whether our approximation is going to be good or bad. And what we turn to is a limit which is a reasonable one within biology, but not necessarily within all areas of science, where if individuals interact over a very long range, and typically it's these interactions which are the nonlinearities in the system which make it difficult to solve. If they did interact over an infinite range, those interactions just become some average, some kind of deterministic number, which can solve stuff consistently. Whereas if instead the interactions are very short range, then these nonlinearities fluctuate quite a lot. So just to illustrate that, this is results for a spatial mode population model. It doesn't really matter very much. And what I've done is just plotted over time for this model how the interaction, as measured at each individual point, changes over time. This just shows each colour corresponds to a different one of these different points, and you can see it fluctuates quite a lot. So for the case where the interactions take place over a relatively short distance, whereas if the interactions take place over a long distance, then each interaction is the average over many other individuals, and this means that the fluctuations then are relatively small. So we use this one over this interaction range as a small parameter. And so we exploit the fact that the model is, I said it's deterministic, but it needn't even be deterministic. All that's important is that the nonlinearities are effectively deterministic, so we can still describe it as a locally stochastic process, but a linear stochastic process. And we use L 1 over L as a measure of proximity to the solvable limit. And then we develop an expansion in 1 over to 1 over L to the power D. So if you've come across the Van Kampen volume expansion, this is a related idea. The Van Kampen volume expansion was a way for was developed for stochastic processes where all individuals interact with all other individuals within a certain volume. And then by the same basic idea, this volume is very large, and these interactions become are averaged out and only fluctuate weakly. So the difference here is that although we have a kind of an interaction volume, the system itself is actually extended over infinite space. So the benefit of that is that the system as a whole won't go extinct unless there's a kind of unless the whole system goes extinct. If that makes sense. So that there's the mean density that then follows some kind of deterministic equation. This is averaged over all space. In the case of the Van Kampen volume expansion, because the system is finite, you get an expansion in terms of the moments, but it doesn't actually tell you directly what the extinction rates are, and the system itself will always go extinct with probability 1. So this limit when is largely biologically interesting. So if you think of trees, how far their seeds go, those can go quite several different multiples of the distance between individuals. And also, although this is a series expansion, sometimes you can make some exact statements from these coefficients. So I'll just give you an illustration of the same as before. So first order perturbation theory is less ambitious than a moment closure. All it tries to do is to give you the gradient of this green curve close to this point, this exactly solved limit. But it does give you that gradient exactly. So what that means is that if, for instance, this mean field is actually 0, so for example, suppose you're looking at stability eigenvalues, and this was an expansion for the stability eigenvalues instead, and you're expanding it around the case when in the mean field, the eigenvalue is 0, then the gradient of this this relationship of eigenvalue to 1 over L to the power D tells you whether there's a finite vicinity within which the system is stable or unstable. And you can also, in principle, go to higher order perturbation theory on how patient you are. Okay. So, although it's a series of expansion and it's valid when this length scale is sufficiently large, it can still be a useful approximation, obviously not numerically very precise, but still useful in terms of telling what the system does, even when this length scale is order 1. When I say 1, here, we normalize the units so that 1 is the typical separation between individuals. So here is this is for a spatially explicit meta-population model. This is the mean occupancy, the probability that the patches are occupied as a function of this parameter 1 over L. And you can see that clearly it's rather poor when L is larger, but on the other hand, it captures the overall behavior and is numerically reasonably good even when this number is, say, about 0.6, 0.7, 0.8. Okay, so just to remind you that we've derived equations for the cumulants for this general reactant catalyst products model for quite general sorts of model. We now assume that all the spatial kernels are of the form of this particular scaling form here. So what this means is that, for example, if we have density-dependent mortality, that means that the mortality of an individual increases due to the presence of other individuals. And the strength of this interaction would then be some kind of kernel, so something which depends upon space. By scaling it in this particular way, so we say that it's some function which is scaled by this parameter epsilon, which is basically 1 over a length scale. We have epsilon to the power d, d is spatial dimension. That just ensures that the overall strength of this interaction averaged over the whole population itself isn't changed by this scale epsilon. So this makes sure that we have a well-defined limit when epsilon approaches 0. And then there we are. We then use our framework to derive an asymptotic expansion for these cumulants in this parameter epsilon. And so in particular, the point at which we've stopped so far, because we think it's the most captures the most important behavior for what we're interested in, is where the first moment, the density of individuals we write as the mean field density Q, and then the first correction due to space and stochasticity is this coefficient P times epsilon to the power D. And then the second order cumulant, spatial covariance, let's call it, already contains this epsilon to the power D, but we basically just look at the lowest order term for this spatial covariance. And then we derive equations of motion for these 3 different coefficients, and we just call these functions on the right-hand side h's, labeled by whether it's q, p, or g, these different components. So the equations for the general model can look a little bit complicated. So I've just written one down, or rather, I've copied it from a paper. I didn't have to tackle it myself. But this is fairly complex. This is for the equation of motion for the 2-point correlation function. So that by itself is rather unwieldy. But the point is that everything here is just combinatorics. So what this means is that we can give it to a computer algebra system. We can program once some code which can extract for a particular process, RPC, which is determined by these various different things here, which can extract what this is for that particular process. And then we can just tell our computer algebra system, here's the model, here are the various processes, and it then spits out the equations for us. So I'm just going to describe a couple of examples. I might not go through all of them because they might not be so interesting to you. Just to illustrate the sorts of models which we've used. The examples were described, were put together in order to illustrate why you might want to do maths rather than do simulations. So it might be those, it might seem a little bit simple. So the first example is a stochastic dynamic landscape metapopulation. So metapopulations are populations of populations. The idea is that you, in many cases, population patches are quite isolated. And the dynamics between patches, the dynamics that the couples of patches tends to take place over a much longer time scale than the dynamics within patches. So a butterfly arrives in a patch here, within a few years there's a healthy population, but the time between these colonization events might be 10 years, 20 years, or something longer. And so this is an often used paradigm for populations which are in highly fragmented landscapes. And the landscape itself is often quite dynamic. So it can be, for instance, that there are butterflies who live on, who require vegetation of a certain height because they require certain microclimates, for example. Or it can be that the habitat for a beetle is a tree, and the tree falls down or is burnt, or something along those lines. So there's dynamics both of the colonization extinction of these patches, and also the existence of the patches themselves is also some process too. So the colonization process here, so this is an empty patch in white. is the rate at which it gets colonised is determined by a sum over the colonisation strengths and all of the other occupied patches nearby. And so C then is the depends upon the distance between this patch X and the other patches I. And C is then this colonisation kernel. And that, yes, that causes this patch to be occupied. Patches go extinct with rates E, so this is just a kind of random process independently. And also, patches can be created and destroyed with these different properties. So this is pretty much the simplest spatially explicit stochastic metapopulation that you can write down. So we can specify these processes in terms of this reactant catalyst product idea. So I've used pink to correspond to the unoccupied patches and blue the occupied patches. And then there are 5 different types of processes which happen. There's the creation of patches at a new point x1, and that's basically corresponds to a so-called immigration process, just the appearance of a new individual. The colonisation process is where an unoccupied patch is colonised by another occupied patch, and the rate at which this happens is then determined by this colonisation rate. And this looks like an infection process, so we just call it infection just because that's one of our generic classes of process. Then patches which are occupied can go extinct at a rate E, and we'll just change it in its height. And then the patches themselves can be destroyed at rate mu, and that means that there's just the patch then vanishes. So this is just a shorthand for the operators which describe the dynamics. We've given them these various different names just as a kind of shorthand, but I could have just written these down more generally as described by the set of reactants, catalysts, and products at a certain rate. Okay. So this is then just a description of these processes, and this is what we actually hand to Mathematica. So this is just a variable which is given to Mathematica to say this is what our model is. So these are just shorthand names for these different processes. These first things are the labels of the different types of individuals. These things are the various parameters, and so on. And then Mathematica pops out the equation of motion for the this is for the mean field density of empty patches and occupied patches. Similarly for spatial autocorrelations, and also for the fluctuations, the stochastic corrections to these mean field equations which I haven't given. So we use this to analyze certain kinds of measures which are used to in conservation biology, well, to inform conservation practice. And these are called connectivity measures. So you may come across this term. The idea is that because habitat patches tend to go, well, eventually an isolated patch will go extinct. So a habitat patch needs to be sufficiently well connected to other habitat patches in order to allow the population as a whole to persist. And so the idea of connectivity was developed a couple of decades ago, inspired by better population ideas. And so these measures of connectivity are often used actually to quantify how good a landscape is for sustaining populations. And it's been used in a variety of tools used to advise reserve design. The best known of these is zonation by and so the idea is that you say that the value of a patch, or the contribution of connectivity from one patch, is just given by the sum of all the nearby patches of some kind of connectivity kernel evaluated for the distance between these different patches. Typically, C is taken to be the dispersal kernel, but it could actually be anything. Now, although this does clearly measure the degree to which the network is connected, there's no underlying theory that says whether this is a good measure, the best measure, whether it would be possible to improve on this by developing some different sort of measure. But this is just a map to illustrate the use of connectivity in the software zonation to prioritize habitat for butterflies within different parts of the UK. The red spots are where these are important for conservation purposes, and the blue ones are the ones which are not so important. The rural where I live isn't looking very good. I'm not quite sure exactly where Cambridge is over here, but anyway. So, as I said, in zonation, connectivity is measured by the sum of all patches weighted by the measured dispersal kernel. But more generally, you could say, well, maybe it should be some other kernel H instead of just the dispersal kernel. So we can say, asking over this class of measures, what would be, how is the performance of this measure as a way of determining how good your landscape is, how is that affected by your choice of what this kernel H is? And so what we did was to say, well, okay, let's evaluate the performance of this measure by seeing how correlated this measurement is to local occupancy. So S of X is the connectivity of a point at of a patch at point X. So we can say how strongly correlated is this measure to the occupancy variable, which is 1 if the patch is occupied and 0 otherwise. And we just did this using a product movement correlation because that's a convenient thing to evaluate within our framework. And then we can ask, how does this correlation between connectivity and occupancy depend upon the various biological parameters which determine the population dynamics, and how does it depend upon our choice of this kernel H, which is up to us, the practitioner, to decide. So just first thing to observe is that we can, if you look at just a reminder that the landscape itself is dynamic, so that means that patches can be created and destroyed. So if this process can be very slow or very fast relative to the medical population dynamics itself. So this just says I've tuned the parameters so that the mean patch occupancy is constant, but I've changed the rate at which the landscape turns over relative to the medical population dynamics described by this extinction here. So here the landscape is very slow. This is a static landscape. Here the landscape is very quick. Essentially, all of the deaths are caused by, or all the extinctions are caused by the habitat being removed. And so the first thing to notice is that this correlation between connectivity and occupancy is weaker when the landscape becomes more dynamic. That's just something which Jenny measured in her PhD. And also that the more static landscapes, so over here, we find that the correlation between connectivity and occupancy is stronger when the occupancy itself is lower. That's essentially because when the occupancy is very, very high, if every patch is occupied, there's no, the contribution of the local connectivity is relatively weak because you're likely to be occupied anyway. Okay, so that's just the first observation. On the other hand, if the landscapes are very dynamic, then the correlations are stronger when the occupancy is higher. So for a very dynamic landscape, this connectivity measure doesn't actually tell you very much if the occupancy is already going to be very, very low. We can see how the choice of kernel affects this correlation by just tuning the length scale of our kernel. So we just assume a certain shape of kernel and change the length scale, lambda, of the connectivity kernel relative to this is the length scale for the dispersal process. So if they're the same, we'd have to be, because this is log, to be 0. And this is just to illustrate essentially that the points are simulations and the lines are the approximation, just to illustrate that they're saying essentially the same thing. So by choosing the kernel more carefully, we can improve the correlation between these two things. So actually, a better connectivity measure might be actually to use a longer length scale than the length scale that's used for the dispersal kernel. That's what I just said. And in fact, we can use a variational calculation to calculate what would actually be the best choice of connectivity kernel. This is what it turns out to be. And the key thing really to take home here is just that if C, these are Fourier transforms, so if C was the original kernel, then clearly H is different from C. That's really the main point. That's really all I want to make here. You can show that the length scale is longer for H than for C, but that's really the key thing to notice. There's no reason why it has to be the same shape, except for very particular choices. Okay, I think I'm not going to dwell on these various different, these other examples. So this is one about optimal foraging, it's about individuals that move around, consume. So this is all about a problem in evolution biology, which is to say, how do you decide how you move around in order to find food? So this particular consumer moves quickly until it finds some food. Once it's found some food, it then starts to move more slowly and then after a while it gets bored and starts moving quickly. And the question is, how is this choice about how rapidly you choose to switch determined by the spatial properties of the resources which the individual eats? So again, I won't go through the various details, just to say this is the kind of model here. We have a model for the food items, and this is actually the food items here are created in clusters, and the way that we do this is actually to have what we call a target, which is created as a point, and then each target creates a certain number of food items. Sorry, the target generator is the artificial process, and the red points are the food targets themselves. They also are ephemeral, and this is then what determines the dynamics of the individual as it eats these things and as it moves around. So, and then what you can get directly from this is tells you how rapidly does your consumer eat food as a function of how rapidly it switches between these different fast and slow moving states. And so if you're too slow, then you tend to miss out on good patches of resources elsewhere. If you're too fast, then you miss out on local concentrations once you encounter some local food. And so the point that I wanted to make was that the model had 9 parameters, but by turning it into a mathematical rather than a simulation model, we can show that actually the optimal strategy depends upon only 2 dimensionless combinations of these parameters. Finally, I won't go through this apart from just to give you a quote from Nick Barton. So the final case study was to look at the spatial decay genetic similarity. So molecular ecologists use spatial variations in similarity of neutral genes or indeed non-neutral genes to infer something about population processes. But unfortunately, the only kinds of models for which they have any good theory are neutral models. And so Nick Barton some time ago was saying that in the case when we have local interactions and selection, the problem is hopelessly complicated. So what we did was to develop a toy model, but one which includes local environment. That's what these large patches are. So two different kinds of habitat patches. These are the biotic individuals are these circles and triangles, and they have different genotypes, and depending upon the match between their genotype and the environment, they have different fitnesses. So again, quite a complex model, including genetics, and what we get is we recover the kind of results which you get for neutral models, and for the non-neutral case, we can show how within this approximation we can calculate what the similarity between 2 alleles is. And in fact, it's most easily expressed in terms of this neutral F, where it is. I guess I think that's right. And again, we have many parameters within the model. The key thing which we wanted to look at was the degree to which the presence of non-neutral genes change the spatial decay of similarity at both the non-neutral and the neutral locus. And it turns out that within the order of this approximation, the neutral locus isn't actually affected by their selection at the non-neutral locus. But we can calculate the relative length scales for these 2 different correlations, and we find that they're determined by these 2 different dimensionless summary parameters for the system. So, just to illustrate why we think it's important for ecologists still to do mathematics rather than simulations, is that mathematical analysis can be more general. So, for example, we have an expression for the optimal choice of the connectivity kernel effectively by searching an infinite dimensional space of choices, which is something which you couldn't do using a simulation model. It just wouldn't be practical. We've also, using analysis, we calculate things directly. So, for example, we have an expression for the optimal switching rate for the optimal forager. Rather than having to search through parameter space and then see the point at which the foraging rate is optimal, instead we can just calculate it directly an expression for that. And also this dimensional reduction, we can show how the model behavior depends upon summary parameters, combinations rather than each parameter independently. can be applied to agents, can be all kinds of things. And this is kind of just a description of the pipeline, just to say how you go about doing things. So you go about saying, here is, in words, what my model does. So for the mega population model, empty patches are created at a rate R, colonized by occupants occupied patches with kernel C, occupied patches go extinct at rate E, and all patches are destroyed at rate U. Turn those into these reaction and catalyst product processes, turn that into computer-readable model specification, and we give that to Mathematica, which then does the perturbation expansion. We can either do analysis directly, we can evaluate these generically. We also have simulation tools which can take this markup and turn it into a simulation model too. There's some caveats. So the reason why I wanted to present this to you was because, of course, ABM's agent-based models are used a lot in the social sciences and in particular in decision-making processes. But there are some differences between the kinds of models which you use in biology and the kinds of models which you might use in social science. So it's natural to assume for biological individuals that they live in an underlying continuous space, that we can model, or that we're interested in mainly the heterogeneity which is generated by the process itself, or where we can include many of the interactions with other individuals, even if they're abiotic, which can still be described as agents with some kind of dynamics. And we're mainly interested in the way in which the population sizes change. So we're interested in births and deaths, and immigration and movement. So I'm no expert, but from what I gather from talking to people in the social sciences, agent-based models tend to be somewhat different because individuals tend to live on a grid. They don't tend to move around very much. There might also be individuals who somehow see everything and don't really have spatial locations at all. The exogenous heterogeneity, the environment is very important, obviously, for practical applications. And mostly you're interested in how these agents change their state or make their decisions based upon the local environment. So it's not that abundance is changing, but rather that they're changing in state. So this means that the framework which we have, well, the contiguous space to grid is one change which we would have to make. These things can all be accounted for. But anyway, so there's a little bit of work to be done technically in order to assume what we've done to agent-based models. There's also the question of whether our asymptotic approximation is actually going to be any good for social sciences. So talking to Karen Brown, he described his agents as interacting with a vicinity of other individuals. It sounded like the kind of interactions were going to be large enough. 10 is enough. Sorry?
I'll let you finish.
Okay. Anyway, but still, what you can get from this sort of framework is some kind of mean field like or simple. I say mean field like it can actually be spatially explicit. It's just that it will give you deterministic approximations to how these agent-based models would behave. These might be useful if you want to explore qualitatively what kinds of behaviours tend to evolve in different circumstances. So Adam Klaskowski gave a talk last week talking about network-based models and game theory. This kind of approach would be comparably good, I'd say, to those sorts of approaches in non-realistic situations where you're interested in understanding the sorts of phenomena which can arise. But I think actually this approach can actually be used in more realistic applied situations. Because first of all, well, primarily I think they can be used for uncertainty quantification and error propagation. So this can be done in two ways. You can actually either use the perturbation expansion itself to calculate or estimate the strength of the noise, the fluctuations, the endogenous fluctuations directly. So within the approximation, that would be something which could be calculated. But also you can use the expressions for the moments directly without doing the approximation to say, how do you calculate this variability in terms of moments? And then you can just measure those moments directly from simulation rather than an approximation to them. So the benefit of doing this is that it gives you a way to calculate the way that the output depends upon the uncertainty in the input without having to change the input multiple times.
we go back to the slide about comparing the two.
Yeah.
Agent-based models like Crafty that was discussed by Callum, they work on a grid because it's easier, not because we think that the world is a grid. If you look at, if you get data of the location of individual farms in the landscape, they are fixed, quenched, but not on a grid. In that sense, I don't think that this is a real, an issue. Yes, there is exogenous heterogeneity, but there is a lot of endogenous heterogeneity as well, which is think about farmer, the age of the farmer, whether he is a hobbyist or a business or profit maximizer. So there is definitely both exogenous and endogenous heterogeneity. I mean, you had, in the examples where you had ponds, this was exogenous heterogeneity in the landscape. For example, if you think about a model like Crafty, what it was basically doing is looking at trying to predict the change in the population of different types of agents, which is not hugely different than birth and death. If you're using that kind of agent-based models as a way of a land use change model, this is basically you are interested in how many, let's say, agent functional types in there of particular type there will be at equilibrium. I think there's more similarity than maybe you think. The one question I had was, you assumed, I think you had an expansion in the scale, but some of the processes were density independent processes like birth and death, which doesn't have any scale. But can you still use an approximation of infinite L going to infinity when you have processes that are completely local?
Absolutely, yes. So the thing about those processes is that they have no scale, but they're also linear. Right. And the fact that they're linear means that they don't cause problems with the
calculation. Because a model like Crafty, for example, is actually non-spatial. So although I had a discussion about this with Callum after the workshop, although you see a map, but in fact the different pixels only interact with the whole of the population in his European model.
Right. Okay. Well, that's obviously a somewhat simpler situation.
I mean, it's not realistic. It's not a very realistic situation. But yeah. So it's but if every individual interacts with the whole population, then the mean field is actually correct.
Yes.
So it's easier.
Sure. Yes. So okay. Well, that is a somewhat simpler situation. There are, of course, many cases where you do have to care about social interactions.
There are, but
Can I ask a very naive question, because this is way outside my knowledge and understanding. You say that these models you use the term best for unrealistic situations and not so good for realistic. And I guess that was to some extent evident in that none of your model behaviours were compared to any empirical data. How do you, as an ecologist, demonstrate that the models are plausible against real behaviours that are observed in the environment?
So the reason why these models are most suited for these more general but not apply to any specific situations is because they don't contain enough detail to be a faithful description of the real behaviour. So there's if you in detail the quantity of behaviour on a real landscape depends upon the fact that the landscape itself has some kind of heterogeneity, which means that the numbers themselves will actually change. It doesn't mean that the quality of behaviour changes very, very much. It's just that to get a good fit to data, these models don't contain, probably in most cases, enough detail in order to take account of all this heterogeneity, which matters for matching the numbers, but not really for your understanding of the system. So what these models do is they contain a certain number of processes, and the processes that they contain are plausible, and the kinds of conclusions which you want to draw from them are not to say something like, oh, we can get a threefold increase in the population by doing X, Y, Z. What they are able to do is to say you're better off, for example, making habitats more connected than you are making large clumsy habitats or something like this. So they can give quite robust qualitative statements about the sorts of strategies which you want to be doing. But if you want to say in more detail exactly what you're doing in a certain circumstance, then you have a tactical model that has more parameters and is fitted directly with those parameters directly from data. Does that answer your question?
I don't think so. I suppose when you're saying that these models are robust, to me, robustness is partly that there is some confidence that it is matching something that is observed and measurable, not necessarily at that site specific, but that underpins the statement that you made that connectivity is more important than patch size.
Yes, so it's robust in terms of the qualitative statements which come out of it, rather than in the details of the actual numbers. So it's, as I say, it's not very robust if you want to say, how do I as a farmer increase my yield by 10%? But it is robust if you want to ask questions about, is this likely to be better than that? Now, to demonstrate that they're robust, you can show that their conclusions are the same to empirical studies. That, of course, doesn't actually prove you've got the right sorts of processes. But it's, they're certainly plausible in terms of saying these things matter, probably, these are probably the dominant processes for determining the overall behavior. But yeah, they're not robust in the sense that you want to take the numbers which come out of them and interpret those literally. Or indeed, that by fitting them a model of this kind to real data, that you really believe that that's going to be a faithful description of that system. I know some people do, but so for example, for a multiple population model, if you want to fit a multiple population model to data, you have to incorporate the differences in quality of the different patches. That's the most important thing. Because the extinction rates and colonization rates depend very much on whether they're large patches or small patches. So you can still do an analysis of a multiple population where patches are always due to have the same properties. And you can also, I mean, I chose the simple model here, but you can use within this framework also a model where you have differences in patch quality too. And that sort of thing isn't going to make much difference to the kinds of conclusions which I was saying, which was saying you should be choosing a kernel with a longer intrinsic length than the dispersal kernel. I mean, actually, one of the conclusions is that your best choice for the connectivity kernel, I didn't present this here, but one of our conclusions in the paper is to say you should be choosing the autocorrelation function for patch occupancy as your choice of connectivity kernel, for example. And that's likely to be quite robust. That's likely to be robust to many aspects of model structure.
I think that perhaps we should not hope for models that are good at everything, that are good at finding general patterns of behavior, identifying key diagnostics of landscape connectivity and its impact on population dynamics and such, and at the same time be useful in tactical management of a specific landscapes. But maybe we can join up in a different way. So I was just thinking that what you showed here is indeed more on the strategic side, most of it. So, but maybe we can derive from that information that can be used in the design of the tactical models, the kinds of elements that have to go in there, or if left out will make it inappropriate for certain kinds of management. So Actually, that's one of two ways in which they can be used together, the strategic models and tactical models. The other way is perhaps that the strategic models can provide something like prior distributions for some parameters that go into the tactical modeling. Is that not a better way of looking at it, rather than just having one model that's supposed to do everything?
I think that's a great suggestion, absolutely. I mean, the difference between the tactical and strategic models in the case of ABMs is really, I think, just a matter of detail, as you suggest. So you tend to use a less detailed model for the strategic approach and a more detailed one for the tactical one. But I think yes, I think that the suggestions are excellent ideas. But I think also that the techniques which we developed in this context of the strategic models, some of those I think do actually map onto the questions which you're asking. So I think
Who first?
So just following on for the comment on empirical evidence, yeah, I appreciate this is a model that's, giving qualitative insights rather than generating specific numbers applicable to a particular site. But the requirement still exists that you should be testing or evaluating those qualitative insights against some kind of empirical data. And I would imagine that one would be therefore looking for asking what empirical patterns are there out there, like qualitative patterns relating to your model, which you can use as confirmation or otherwise of the qualitative patterns that you're predicting. When you say robust, I guess you mean robust against the particular details of the models or the numbers, but what I think was meant is robustness against empirical data.
sure. And I use robust in two different ways, and actually neither of them was really to do with their use to describe data directly. But here is one example of what you're describing. So this is saying, how does, as a function of the metapopulation turnover rate, how does the correlation between connectivity and occupancy depend upon this turnover rate? So empirical data, as I said, Jenny in her PhD showed this, that you do find this negative correlation. So that's the kind of conclusion which you can get from this model, which you can test directly, is to say, is it the case that metapopulations that have more higher rate of turnover have a lower correlation between occupancy and connectivity? And you can similarly ask the question of whether is the correlation between occupancy and connectivity higher or lower in realised metapopulations where the occupancy is higher or lower.
But is this modeled data or is this empirical data?
This is from the model. I haven't shown the real data, but this is the kind of thing that you could test against empirical data. So this is the kind of pattern which I expect to be robust. And so if you then have, say, static and dynamic landscapes, and then look at these correlations, this is the sort of thing you should do. So that's sort of a robustness in the sense of seeing similar patterns. As I say, that's really what the examples that I've given. I think they could be useful. I also use the term robust to describe the approximation, and that was robustness in the sense that there's a wide range of situations in principle when it will give a good approximation to these processes. It doesn't mean that the model is a good description of reality, just that the approximation is a good description of the model.
I was going to say that something similar to you actually, that there's no reason in principle why you couldn't test it if you had enough data. You want some kind of data over many patches, or like lots of different patchy systems to compare the different patchy systems that are in different that have different input parameters. But also, I think it's fine, as in other models, to kind of validate the little individual relationships you put in there, like, well, what is the death rate of a certain species, or that you can measure, and that is a parameter that goes into the model. So I suppose that is parameterizing it. It's not a test of the model, but it definitely increases its believability if you've got your parameters from something real, rather than imagining them.
So, I can understand the reason you can't necessarily directly test the data because, for example, an individual area may have a lot of details about terrain and exactly how the trees are and how the landscape is, what the other predators are that just aren't in. Yeah. Okay. So if you directly matched, well, it wouldn't because of other features. But I mean, it seems to me that what you mean by it being robust is that you're making an assertion that were you to extrapolate these other features in, which would be a different job for each possible landscape, that your conclusion would more or less survive. So it seems to me that the right way to demonstrate robustness is to think about the main reasons that your model can't directly be validated on this data, build some kind of surrogate model for that, where you're not actually going to match it to the data because each one is going to be different and that'll just be a hugely hard job, but then to test whether your model actually is robust across the kind of elaborations that you could build in, which seems to be quite doable in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, it can be doable either as a further kind of perturbation to these sorts of models or
Yeah. I mean, in fact, you want to think, rather than a perturbation, you would actually want to nominally imagine environments, I think, and then just test how robust your conclusions are.
Good stuff. So again, I have to admit I didn't follow the details of mathematics we do, but I was interested in the applicability of it. And say we were interested in calculating out the probability of extinction of a lot of species across a complex surface, a complex habitat. Is the approach you're suggesting, does that give us calculation advantages in terms of speed? In terms of speed, so you've got this approximation, which uses the analytical forms. Can we calculate out quickly, therefore, over some long-term process, how likely it would be for a species to go extinct, or maybe many species?
There's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer
Very
is
short for this.
okay. So the short answer is that yes, you can use these kind of approximations to calculate things like extinctions and rates of decline and such like. The long answer is that, what, do you want the long answer?
Well,
And
would that be quick?
would it be quick?
Is really my question.
Well, I guess the other short answer is to say that it can be done, but actually a bit more of there needs to be a little more development of the approach because we deal with moments, that's averages of things.
Yeah.
Extinctions aren't always well described by that. So you can describe rates of decay, but to calculate actual extinctions, you'd have to give a little bit more thought about how you relate.
Okay, but you could put a threshold in or something and say.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you can. Problem is that extinction thresholds are probably not to be calculated awfully well. So here's an example of an extinction threshold. Somewhere over there to the right, all these things are going to go extinct. But as you can see, the approximation gets worse and worse as you get closer to that. The reason understood by physicists.
So I'm just thinking, like, if what you want to do is to explore different sort of organisation of the landscape, say patches of different farming techniques or stuff, you want to see how that might play out over time to think what the consequences are for various species. But you want to do that in optimisation, so you're looking around at all different sort of combinations. Could this give us a quick approach, effectively, to understanding what the consequences are?
Yes, so
rather than running out
it can do it, but again, you have to do a little more legwork in order to get this, because this is based on first and second moments. You have to either see whether this quantity that you're describing is easily expressed in those terms, or you do some kind of equivalent expansion of other things. So what I didn't talk about here was that, well, I can hint at it. We have a similar expansion for stability eigenvalues, so things which determine whether a point is a stable fixed point or whether it's a saddle point or such like. So we can do an equivalent calculation there. Its formula looks quite different because those things aren't actually simply described in terms of these spatial moments. But you can still use the same basic idea. The idea of the approximation is that as long as you have interaction with a large enough other individuals, then those fluctuations around some sort of model are relatively small, so you can still do that. Just the expansion itself. But yes, you can certainly do this.
So the most population models, like the Levens model and the spatially realistic Levens model, have have solutions where the if you don't have enough habitat, the equilibrium is zero, don't they?
You're saying that they go extinct if the
Yeah, it goes deterministically extinct rather than stochastically extinct.
yes, that's right. So
And-
that's what these things tend to calculate is they give you the so
Deterministic extinction.
to get back to the long answer. With the example which all the examples that I've given have this kind of assumption of spatial homogeneity, and so your species is everywhere. Because your species is everywhere, there's no stochastic extinctions, no global stochastic extinctions. All that you get is that under certain conditions, the system as a whole will go extinct in a way which looks like deterministic extinction. So you can calculate that.
Which I think we're both interested in this question because you've been talking about this as a potential application for future ELMS stuff through DEFRA. But are you saying that it would be easier through this to look at, for instance, proportional how a pattern affects the likelihood of occupancy rather than the probability of overall extinction? Are there other currencies that are better behaved in this context?
Yes.
Because
yeah.
the choice of extinction is one which would be, in some ways, easy to sell emotionally, but if it's better to put this in terms of proportional occupancy, cool.
Yes, so proportional occupancy certainly is that's the easiest thing to look at because that's really the concept we're talking about. This overall thing, the extinction thing, it's not a probability because of the fact that there's an unfinite system. So it's either is due to extinction or not. But again, you can just do a little bit more work and turn it into a property of extinction in a finite system. That's not necessarily well.
So kind of, I mean, many ecological processes are like mating, is short range.
Yeah.
I find it surprising that it actually works so well. Do you have any feeling, why does this work? Where you might expect that a long-range kernel approximation might actually not be the right
Yeah,
ecological.
so we haven't actually looked at any examples where we have mating as such. We have examples of genetics which are haploid rather than diploid. The
Yeah,
mating is short
competition.
range. Sorry.
You have competition.
That's right, yes, we have competition, but the examples such as mating, although the individual that you mate with is near to you, as long as you're choosing from a large enough number of possible mates, that's really what matters for the population
So that under low occupancy or low total population, then that might be worse than.
Sure, yes. If occupancy is low, if the distance between individuals is small compared to, is large compared to the interaction ranges, this really doesn't work well at all.
The effects.
Well, any effects don't necessarily have to be such short range. It can be cooperative